We are nearing completion of our 2,000-year trip through the age of Pisces and now entering into the new age of Aquarius. These ages are defined by the precession of the equinoxes, which is where Earth's axis, which is on a tilt, gradually precesses and traces a circle over the 12 constellations in the zodiac, like the hand of a celestial clock, 2,166 years per constellation. Plato called the full cycle a great year, and each of the 12 segments great months. And the great month of Pisces, which we are now leaving, was many things. This was the Christian age, so a new landscape of good and evil was established, with Christ on one side and Satan on the other. It was also a spiritual age where the soul was elevated in importance far above the body, and the spiritual domain of heaven was elevated far above the fallen domain of earth. But for all its spiritual illumination, Pisces was also characterized by a kind of darkness. We understood ourselves and the reality that we lived in through metaphor and symbols and narrative and visionary art. These things are more fluid than they are concrete. So we were a bit like the fish which symbolize Pisces, completely immersed and submerged in our understanding of reality, but at the same time sort of oblivious to it, sort of unaware of the waters that we swam in. But this new age of Aquarius is different. In this age of illumination, all of these dark waters need to be cleared. All of these strange seas need to be explored. And rather than being fish submerged in water, we need to become water carriers. We need to give form and structure to these things. And of course, the symbol for Aquarius is the water carrier. And this process of illumination has already started. In the 17th and 18th centuries, we began to master a new way of thinking. We sharpened our instruments of reason and rational thought, and we began the great dissection of nature herself. We became scientists. But a few centuries later, we seem to have gotten cold feet. Serious inquiry and investigation now is contained to approved institutions and looks only into approved domains. We seem to be afraid. I don't know if we're brave enough today to investigate psychic phenomena or UAPs or our collective shadow or God. And I'm not suggesting we believe any of these things, only that we make serious investigations into them. Because we're in a period of chaos, and chaotic times call for vision, for information, for understanding, for calmly assessing before we take some action. And I believe we now have the technology necessary to do this in a new way. A world computer is being constructed at the center of the internet, and upon this platform we can build new institutions for sense-making that are efficient, effective, economically aligned, resilient to capture. And with these institutions, we can focus the brightest minds onto the most important problems, and we can find the truth. Jung said, "That which you need most will be found where you least want to look." I believe this is true not just for the individual, but for all of mankind. I believe it's time we look. This video is going to consist of 3 major parts: past, present, and future. So first we'll look back through human history and try to get a sense for the long evolution of human thinking, specifically in terms of our model of reality, the matrix that we live in. We'll look at how this matrix has changed over time, how it's been blown apart and replaced with new models repeatedly. And in doing this, hopefully we can get a sense for what the next steps are for us. Then we will zoom in on the present and look at the existing matrix that we live in, the existing information landscape, and we'll think about what the dynamics are at play here. What are the institutions which uphold and reinforce this existing landscape? And also look at what are on the fringes. What are these domains that are sort of neglected or not investigated, and whether there is anything worth looking at there. And then how can we investigate? How can we upgrade this model? So the final phase is I want to talk about concrete ideas for how we can actually build things which allow the exploration and generation and creation of a new model, a new matrix. And if we can achieve that, if we can build a new system, then perhaps we can, ride that into the future, into the new age, into the new Aion. First, let me say why I invoked astrology and kind of the framework that I'm taking to this historical examination. So I'm basing a lot of this on Carl Jung's book Aion, and this was written in 1951, and what Aion does is tries to draw these parallels between the long evolution of human thinking, the long arcs and twists and bends of history, and the changing of the constellations above us, this precession of the equinoxes that I described. And Jung makes this case brilliantly in this book Aion, and he finds these truly bizarre parallels between these two things, and I'm going to use that as kind of the framework to think about this stuff. Now, if you don't believe in any of that, if you don't believe the astrology, that's actually totally fine. None of the video really hinges on that. I just find it to be a very useful framework, a very useful guide for how to think about this a little bit. And something I'll say about Jung is I think Jung was one of the great thinkers of all time, and certainly the 20th century. I think of specifically Nietzsche and Jung as being sort of secular religious prophets. So I think what a lot of religious prophets in the past have done is perhaps they're tapping into something mystical and otherworldly, but I think maybe it's as simple as they're tapping so deeply into the human collective unconscious, into their minds, into their unconscious. They peer so deeply into that place that they can see into the future. They can get a sense for these great long currents that are sort of winding through history. So in a previous era, people would perhaps get these glimpses of these deep currents, and they would make a prophecy. They would see into the future. Now, I think Nietzsche and Jung, they were of this caliber. I think they were doing the same thing, but they came at a time where the age of the religious prophet had passed, right? They came into this secular world, so we think of them and recognize them as philosophers and scientists. But I think these two individuals specifically were of that highest tier, almost like a secular prophet. So I think what Jung has to say here is worth considering. And also, Jordan Peterson called Aion the most terrifying book he had ever read. So I won't go into exactly why he said that, but there's some good stuff in the book. So Aion, I would say, is about these great tides of history that sort of flow through the years and influence us, carry us in a certain direction. And I think the way we normally think about history and the unfolding of the future is that we think that you can't really predict anything about it. Certainly you can say certain trends like technology will improve, human population will grow perhaps, but these are pretty basic. They don't tell us all that much. And when we think of how to predict the evolution of human thinking, human values over the course of thousands of years, we tend to think that that's just impossible, and there's no point even trying because the system is a complex adaptive system. It's far too complex. And maybe that's true, but maybe it's more like we're on this great ocean. You're on a surfboard in this ocean, and there's waves and things are moving around and the waves come and go. And perhaps if you are able to stand up on your surfboard high enough, you can see into the distance and you can see these long rolling waves that are far away, but they're certainly coming, right? The ocean is very chaotic. You can't actually predict the exact movements of the ocean, but you can, if you stand high enough and look far enough, you can actually see these waves come in. And perhaps history is like that. And so in a sense, then, history would be somewhat predetermined, but I think maybe the way that it actually works is that these waves of history do come and go, so it's predetermined in a sense, but that we can influence things a little bit. perhaps we can decide whether to surf the wave or not. We can maybe influence and nudge the wave left or right. So I don't think you can stop the waves of history, but maybe you can nudge it left or right, and then the wave breaks left or right, and you can surf it more easily. So that being said, I'll now look at some of these waves, some of these eras in our history. The first great wave of history that we'll look at is the Age of Aries. This was the period before Christ, so approximately the 2,000 years before Christ, so 2000 BC roughly to 0. And this age is symbolized by the ram, and Aries is a fire sign. Aries is associated with the planet Mars, which is of course the god of war. And the symbol for Aries, the ram, is not exactly an animal of spiritual enlightenment or intellectual expansion. The ram is an animal which rams things with its head. It's a symbol of force and power and determination. And this is a good symbol for this age. Because this was the age of the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans. This was the time of Alexander the Great. This was a time where people were building empires. There was a great deal of war. What dictated which peoples lived and which died would depend a lot on military mastery. So the Romans, for example, called themselves sons of Mars because they held this value as being one of the highest values of strength and military might. And that actually worked out very well for them, right? Rome expanded to the size that it did. It became the greatest empire on earth at the time because they were doing something right? And this, I think, is an important point. You know, people in this era, they would have looked up to certain characters like Achilles, Heracles, who later became Hercules, people like that. They would have worshipped these gods like Mars and these other gods representing strength. And their morality, their value system would reflect that as well, right? The things which these people considered to be good would have been, you know, you should be strong, you should achieve some mastery, you should be perhaps just as well, and so on. But the strength is really important. It has to be up there. And, you know, Nietzsche, for example, called this a master morality. These people had a morality that reflected sort of the position of a master as opposed to a slave. And today we look at that and we might think that's barbaric, that's wrong, their values were wrong. But I think that's incorrect in a sense. If you think of, if you were in that time and you embodied the values of today or the values that would come later as a result of Christ, if you embodied those values, you would probably just be enslaved or killed. So it's kind of hard in a practical sense to say that those values are objectively better if, when acted out in that period, they would have resulted in your death or enslavement. You can at least see, in a certain practical sense, this time, the good and evil, this morality, this might makes right, strength sort of thing, had a certain truth to it. And so this age of Aries had that theme. It had this strength sort of theme. But toward the end of Aries, toward the end of this age, a new way of being was introduced. This kind of raw brutality, force way of being actually started to lose its advantage. And a new game was introduced by Christ. So Christ ushers in this new age, this new wave of history, and this is the age of Pisces. This is symbolized by the two fish. And the new game that Christ introduces involves a new morality, a new good and evil. So the morality of the previous age of Aries, of the Romans, which was this strength thing that I mentioned, is actually inverted. So the Romans, who embodied this sort of master morality, as Nietzsche called it, was flipped. And in this new age of Pisces, the Christian values actually would look at those traits of a slave or a master. They would have looked at those traits as evil. So that kind of domination and subjugation was now considered evil. You don't want that. You don't want to do that. You don't want to embody that. Instead, it was this elevation after Christ of these, what Nietzsche would call slave values, which were just values and virtues that were available to the masses, to the slaves. These are things like, temperance and patience and forgiveness and that sort of ability to endure suffering and to, not give up. And this new game, this new way of being was actually incredibly strong. So despite the fact that the first fish of Pisces, Jesus Christ, who Jung called him, I think, the last ram of Aries and the first fish of Pisces. He was the first to embody, the first model of this new game, this new way of being. He, was killed. He died at the hands of the Romans. And despite that fact, he, in a sense, conquered Rome posthumously, because 300 years after his death, Constantine converts to Christianity. And Christianity at that time was rapidly expanding and eventually conquered much of the Western world. So this new way of being introduced by Christ was the new game for this age. It was the new it was the theme for this age, was this new good and evil, these new polarities. So the age of Pisces, of course, is symbolized by the two fish. They're swimming in opposite directions. They're kind of opposites. And this was an age of opposites. It was an age of heaven and hell, Christ and Satan. As I mentioned, it was this spiritual elevation where the soul is sort of separated from the body. And it's like the soul is the thing that matters. And the body, which is kind of this pagan, like the age of Aries maybe would have placed more importance or value on your physical body. As we move into Pisces, that shifts, and it's no, your soul should be elevated. Your body is sort of, you shouldn't really put too much focus on it. You shouldn't really think about it. You should even deny your body. So we move into this we move upward into this spirit, into this heady domain of Pisces. And this evolution, this age continues to unfold. And one of the more interesting facts that Jung talks about in the book is that if you actually look at the constellation of Pisces and how it's laid out in the stars, you have these two fishes, right? And the fishes are actually laid out in the actual constellation, like in the path that the precession of the equinoxes sort of follows. It starts with the first fish, and then about halfway through this age, or a little more, we move into the second fish. And I won't go into this too much, but much of what Jung talks about in the book is that the evolution of our thinking and our existence through the age of Pisces mirrors this. We start out with the first fish of Christ, like the kind of earth is pointed at the first fish when Christ is born. And then by the time it transitions to the second fish, we start to move into this anti-Christian, sort of Luciferian existence. So these two fish, these represent Christ and Satan, these opposites, these like warring brothers. And this evolution is reflected in our thinking. So as we move nearing sort of halfway or a bit more than halfway through Pisces, we start to move into this new reality. This is the ascension of the scientific way of viewing things, this Luciferian sort of energy of this new way of being. And when I say this way of being was Luciferian, that's not any kind of value judgment on it. It's just that this new ethic, this new energy, was opposite to the previous one, where previously the Christian adherents would have said, don't bother investigating the natural world too much. That was actually a belief early in the first part of this age. Like, there's nothing of value you're going to find by examining and dissecting nature. Everything you need is in revelation. That's all you need. And similarly, like, don't don't focus on your body too much. Your soul is what matters. Then, as we enter this new energy of this scientific Luciferian view, that changes. And the more inquisitive people in the church, actually, they start to turn their eye to nature and they start to examine it and open it up and dissect it. And then this process sort of continues, and this was the birth of science. And of course, the perhaps unforeseen consequence of doing this was that we started to discover and sort of pull apart the matrix that was around us, this entire cosmos, this worldview that we lived in, that we existed in. We didn't know at the time, I think, but as we were continually analyzing and picking things apart, the whole structure started to collapse around us. And you can think of these worldviews, like I have these models here. This is the geocentric model. So the Earth is at the center. You have some stars, but they're just like points of light. They're very small. So here our universe is very small. It's like the Earth and then this sphere around it and heaven. Then as we start to investigate and expand the scientific way of viewing, we shatter that and we get this first heliocentric model where, okay, Earth's not the center, it's the sun. Things are way more complicated. And of course, following that, we start to unravel things further. And it's not just our understanding of like the cosmos that changes, it's our understanding of ourselves, right? We, for all of history previously, had this belief, this deep knowledge that we lived underneath a great father, right? That there was this great all-powerful father, this being who watched us and cared about us and had some interest in our future and guided us in all of these things. And regardless of the truth of whether that was true or not or whatever, it doesn't matter. Our belief was always that that was the case. Now, for the first time in history, our belief of that was shattered. And we found ourselves in this situation. This is Nietzsche staring off into the abyss somewhere. This is Wanderer Above a Sea of Fog, which captures sort of this feeling. This was, this scientific revolution, of course, culminated, or it resulted in Nietzsche declaring that God is dead. We've killed God. This whole thing has collapsed, right? And this is the mood. This is the mood of that era. It's this, we're looking out over this landscape and we're alone and it's desolate and we're kind of whirling and we're in this strange place we've never been before, which is desolation. I think this painting also captures this feeling. It's this, I don't think we wanted to admit, we've kind of hidden from ourselves that this is how it feels, but, killing God, like losing that great father, I think, at a spiritual level, has been and still is this terrifying reality. It's, my God, we're still reeling from that murder, if you want to call it that. And of course, Nietzsche has some really beautifully haunting passages describing this, and here's one of them. Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Where are we moving? Are we not continually falling backwards, sideways, and in all directions? Do top and bottom still remain? Are we not wandering through infinite nothingness? Is not the breath of empty space in our faces? Has it not grown colder? Is night not continually closing in on us? That is approximately how I believe we felt in a spiritual sense around this time. And I think that's, roughly speaking, still where we are. And that brings us into the modern age. So, of course, after this scientific revolution, we had the fruits of the scientific revolution were that it created incredible technology. So we just catapult into the future. We're now moving quicker than we can possibly imagine. And I think we still have this spiritual, you know, PTSD. I think we have spiritual PTSD from the killing of God, becoming alone in the universe. We haven't really faced that. And also, a part of that, this great scientific fruit that has come to us, all of these great inventions and so on, what came along with that was a brief period where we thought, we're good. You know, we've got this science figured out. Like, we're going to have the laws of reality. They're going to be Newtonian. They'll be really pretty, make sense. And then we'll just enter into a new age of like prosperity. But 20th century, we have 2 world wars, right? Greatest wars in history, most death in history in any wars, a great mechanization of destruction. So this technology also seemed to have this horrible double-edged sword kind of quality to it, of course. Naturally, it has that. And so we find ourselves having perhaps double PTSD where, you know, the killing of God, we got this spiritual PTSD and we're alone in this nothingness. And then this technology was great, but it also resulted in this massive trauma that we're still kind of trying to recover from today. I think it was Freud who said that a man cannot truly become a man until his father has died. And Jung said, yes, but that death can be symbolic. And I think there's something really powerful in that, and I think there's something true in that. And I think the situation is actually kind of the same here, where the collective, that, you know, that meta person, that meta man thing, has reached this point of perhaps adolescence, of adulthood, where its father, God the Father, has died. And now, and only now, can it become a man. Can it step into its fate? Can it decide its future? And I think that's much of what Nietzsche's kind of philosophy was, that we have done this. We have stepped over the threshold. We cannot go back. And all we can do now is march forward, decide our future. Another way to think about this, to bring it back to the waves of history analogy, is that we were surfing the wave of Pisces, that previous age. We surfed that wave. We rode it a certain distance. But then at the end of it, you know, crashed over us and really beat us up. And maybe like a shark bit us as well. Like, the death of God was a hard crash of that wave pummeling us. And then maybe World War I and II were like 2 sharks that also bit us while we were underwater. And now we're like coming up for air, taking stock of where we are, bleeding. And I think the spiritual kind of feeling of this age, I think, is for a lot of people is, I don't think I want to surf anymore, man. I want to get out of the water. I don't think I want to do this. But of course, another wave is coming. Like, the waves keep coming, and all we can do is get back on the board and keep surfing. So I think in this new age of Aquarius, we need to figure out how to surf it. So what I'll describe is kind of how I think we should do that and where we are in this. So I mentioned already these previous models. This whole evolution I've just described involves these transition from these different models of reality, these different matrices. And, you know, we go from geocentric to heliocentric to this new model, which is vast galaxies and all of these things. And underneath all of that is incomprehensible math. And that's where we are now. And so now let's zoom in on our model in terms of both our understanding of the reality we live in, our understanding of ourselves, how we collect and make sense of all of these things, and so on. So what I'm trying to depict here is something like the information landscape, the matrix, in terms of what are the like pieces of information that we have making up our worldview. So each of these little rectangles is meant to be a like a piece of information. Obviously, the real matrix would have many more, but this is a representation. And these colors are meant to indicate sort of the how hot a piece of information is. So green would be things that are completely accepted by everybody. These are like the commonly held beliefs. They're not contentious, and in fact, the institutions which sort of have influence or control over this matrix, they like these bits of information. These are promoted. Then the blue bits, these are meant to be things that are not widely known, and they're sort of neutral. So much of science would fall into this category, right? Like most scientific facts are like they're neutral in terms of like their political valence, but they're just not known by most people. Like the vast amount of science in the world is known by pretty narrow, small groups of people. So most of this stuff is not part of like the core beliefs, the core matrix, right? But they're neutral. Then we move out to yellow, orange, and red. And these things are more contentious. They're more, they're considered more dangerous. They're ideas that are not favored by the institutions which have influence or stake in this existing system. And so naturally we move out into these fringes, and we get into these things that are sort of more contentious. And I also have, so on the kind of fringes of this entire structure, this entire information landscape, I have a bunch of things that are, variations of like considered pseudoscience or just politically dangerous conspiracy theories, etc. And I'll talk about those. I'll go over them pretty quickly. But I also have on the edges here a bunch of science. So here I've just got a bunch of facts from physics. These are mainstream findings from physics. And the reason that I have these on the fringes is that I would consider all of these things that are on the fringes, these are sort of like, in one way or another, they're kind of matrix breaking pieces of information. Or they're like damaging. They're things which would sort of impact this paradigm and maybe blow it apart, right? Just like these previous instances where our matrices, our models of reality were blown apart, right? The scientific revolution didn't start out with the intention necessarily to shatter the cosmos, but it just kept finding things. And then it figured out that like the sun's the center, and that kind of unravels stuff and so on. So these things along the edges are just like that. Maybe. Some of them are less so, some of them are more so. But the reason I've included these findings from physics on the fringes is because like physics, the stuff that's coming out of physics today is completely crazy. It's completely insane. Like it's actually hard to imagine how we could reconcile these things from physics with our understanding of reality. They're actually very counter to our understanding of reality, but they're neutral, and almost nobody knows about them, right? It's a very narrow set of these priestly theoretical physicists who are aware of how bizarre the universe actually is. And so I've included them on the fringes there. And so I'll go through, do a quick tour through all of these and just give some notes and highlights, and then we'll talk about how this structure is maintained and then solutions for how to upgrade it. Okay, let's look at physics first, because that's the one I mentioned already. So there's all of these incredibly bizarre things going on in physics, especially the quantum things, which I'm sure you're aware of. But some truly strange stuff is at the heart of physics. Like maybe perpetual motion is possible at the quantum level, which is supposed to be totally impossible, right? The potential to pull energy out of nothing, which is very strange. Our reality may be the sum of all possible realities, which sounds very esoteric, not very scientific, but somehow it is. We may live in a holographic universe where the base reality is some sort of two-dimensional sheet, and then our reality sort of emerges out of it like a hologram. We have Bell's theorem being proved, which is well worth looking into. This is basically a proof that the quantum probabilistic weirdness, where a particle is going to go one way or another, or an electron will be in one position or another, it was believed or hoped for a long time that we were just mismeasuring things. We weren't quite seeing. There was some hidden variable that was causing things to be sort of appear random, but it wasn't. But no, it's random. The fundamental truth of the universe is that there is this probabilistic, non-determined weirdness actually governing things, which is very strange. We have the potential for time to emerge from entanglement, etc., etc. And also, consciousness may have some quantum component inside of neurons. So my point with this is that this is all mainstream, like physics. Physics is our most solid science, and this is what they find. And so when I think about these other weird domains that we'll look at, people dismiss them very quickly because they think that's impossible. It's not scientific for, psychic phenomena to exist. But that's just not true. Like, our physics, our science is not complete. We know our models, the standard model is not done. And at the bottom of physics, there's all these super bizarre things, which they at least seem to leave open the possibility for, on top of that substrate of very strange phenomena, you could have these resultant higher level strange phenomena, like maybe psychic phenomena. I don't actually see any way in which science really rules those things out. Maybe when you have a complete and finished model of physics, and then you can extrapolate, you can then, say for sure, no, this thing is not possible because we know how the physics works, but we do not have that. We're not there. So if you look into so-called psi phenomena, which is like psychic phenomena, telekinesis, etc., there's actually a whole bunch of these papers written, and I won't go over all of them, but they're incredibly interesting and strange. There's a whole bunch of papers, tons of them, that at least claim that there are real effects, that there's some real statistical effect to some of these psychic things, right? So an example is this one. This study, they had these people try to influence this random number generator and, have the random number generator produce like a higher number or a lower number. And there should be no effect, right? There should be zero effect. But there seems to be some effect, some small, not tremendous, but some small effect, but statistically significant. So what do you do with that? Obviously, one answer is that this study is flawed. And I found things reading some of this research. I found some papers saying that all of this psi stuff is the result of bad science, it's bad measurement, etc. But then I found others that claim the opposite, that they're like, look, we've seen enough evidence now, we have to start taking this seriously. There is something there. And of course, there's all of these interesting investigations that the Army and the CIA have made into these things, which is well worth looking at. Another sort of related fringe field would be the whole domain of psychedelic entities. Terence McKenna, obviously the pioneer here, and the CIA and these other agencies have done investigations into this. I'm sure you've heard of MK Ultra, well worth looking up. MK Naomi, and so there's been investigation into these things, but they seem to be, like the kind of mainstream of science and our institutions. They don't like these things, and it's understandable why. But what I think we should do, I think it's time that we investigate these things, that we just make an honest investigation into them and just, see what's there. If there's nothing there, great. I can forget about it. But if there's anything there, right, like in the case of these psychic phenomena, if there is any effect, statistically significant, reproducible effect, even if it's subtle, but if it's solid, if it's there, that is huge. We have to find out what's going on. Because if there's any little thing there, that means there's some mechanism we don't know about. There's a whole bunch of discoveries to be made. And of course, another sort of fringe thing that's been in the news a lot lately is the whole UAP thing. And this one, again, is like people don't really want to talk about it, but it is kind of breaching into the mainstream a little bit. You have these various people testifying before these committees and courts and Congress and saying, like, they're real, we worked on it. There was the Navy who I think came out and said, we don't know what they are, but they're definitely there. There's something there. And this again would be a massive discovery, right? This would be huge. It's a huge deal if this is real. And it seems by now that at least there's enough evidence or enough something that we should embark on a serious investigation. But again, the mainstream institutions, they don't want to touch it. So investigations into these crazy things is done by random people on the internet, which is okay, but like the rigor isn't always there. So, you know, we should find a way to achieve that rigor. This is just like alternate histories and these crazy weird things that conspiracy theorist types find through history, these ancient aliens and so on. Again, I have no idea how true any of these things are. I haven't actually done that much research, but they seem interesting. And, you know, surely it's worth a little bit of budget, a few $1,000,000 a year to have some like honest people with integrity kind of investigate these things. I think that would be interesting. Then we go to this other area of the fringes, which I would call probably something like conspiracy theories. And, you know, again, I'm not asserting or suggesting that many of these things are true, except the ones that are actually proven already to be true. Like, that's one of the things that people kind of don't know very often about these so-called conspiracy theories, is there's a whole bunch that are just true. Like, that have Wikipedia pages and they've had hearings and the documents have come out and it's like, yep, there's no denial that's being made of whether it's true or not. Like this Tuskegee thing, you may have heard of that. Operation Northwoods, which was a proposed false flag. There's all the NSA stuff that Snowden brought to light. There's these like ominous quotes from former presidents. There's a lot of these very strange things that some of them are just known, they're just actually true, and then some are definitely considered conspiracy theories, like they're not true, or the asserted kind of belief that the system wants to kind of push forward is that they're not true. And I don't know. Like, who knows if they're true? I'm sure a lot of them are not. But because this information graph, our matrix, is largely under the control of certain institutions, it's very hard to investigate these things. It's very hard to navigate this information graph because there's a bunch of stuff that we found that like is true, but the institutions don't want to touch it. So just because there's some other thing they don't want to touch, we can't actually conclude, well, it's not true. So there's this muddying effect that's going on. And it's a challenging problem because, you know, currently what happens is the internet at large just kind of takes these things and runs with them, and you have these independent people doing their research, and some of that research is good, perhaps, but a lot of it is really low quality and low rigor, and there's a lot of motivated reasoning. This is a valid criticism that people make of these kind of conspiratorial people, is there's a lack of rigor very often. So the internet is just this ocean that's chaotic and full of these, you know, there's all these people and this information, and they're trying to make sense of it, but we don't know who to trust. There's bad actors, there's people who just aren't very good at reasoning through things. So it's this giant chaotic mess. And our institutions, which are the ones who are supposed to help us make sense of this, we know that they are captured at least to some degree, right? So if we look at, you know, there's a million different cases you could find, but you can see that the media corporations, like there's a few corporations that end up owning almost all of the little ones. So there's clearly like a centralization of control, of course. There's all of these suspicious activities that, I'm sure you're aware of a lot of these. There's these, explicit signals where you can see the result of the centralization actually manifest. This famous clip where like 36 different news agencies say the same line. And so it's hard for us to navigate this ocean of information with this kind of the capturing of our institutions. And we also have stuff like the Twitter files, where we've seen that the social media companies are not all that different. There's different dynamics at play. There is more of a, obviously it's social media, so people can share things and so on. But there's some censorship, some capturing that happens there as well. And finally, we have, so I guess the media, I would say, is in charge of, it's our institutions, the apparatus by which we shine light on this entire structure. So like we have this big information structure, this big information graph, and there's tons of stuff in it. And the media organizations, we can think of them as being shining the magnifying glass on certain components, certain corners of this structure. So these guys are largely in charge of directing the attention and sort of shine the light here, but not here, right? Shine the light in here, but not over here. And it's really, the silence is very loud sometimes on certain topics, right? You can see, if you pay attention, how these organs of information and media direct our attention. We can also think about the universities as playing a different role, because contrast to the media organizations, which direct attention, the universities are largely in charge of expanding the graph, right? So that's where a lot of the science is done. So a lot of the new discoveries and pushing the frontiers of this graph, this matrix, that is largely handled by the universities. And we can see there too a certain amount of corruption or centralization, at least. Like I think they're not entirely corrupt, but there's a certain centralization and a falling off of efficiency with these institutions. So you can see like the output, the efficiency of science in terms of the number of discoveries made per researcher is actually going down. We're becoming less effective. And this is a whole fascinating rabbit hole. If you look at how many papers are published and compared to how many people actually read them, how many times they're cited, like most papers, first of all, most papers don't lead to a turnover of central ideas. What they're finding is that, tons and tons of papers are published, but there's this ossification where the central ideas in a field are not changed. Like the beliefs are actually starting to solidify, and science being done is not actually changing these fundamental beliefs, which is probably a sign that it's no longer functional in the same way that it used to be. And then you also have these facts from the peer review science world, where a lot of the science seems to be becoming increasingly fake. Like most of the papers don't publish their data. 20% of genetics papers have totally useless data because Excel auto-corrected the names of genes into months and years. Like things are just not being done at the standard that we might think. There's this finding where some people were trying to study the effectiveness of peer review and science, and they put out these papers with purposely fake findings and results that did not follow from their data to see if anyone in the peer review process would catch it. And most of the time they didn't, or very often they wouldn't find it. So it seems, and many people have spoken about this, this kind of decline in productivity in science. And it just seems that the generally, I would say, what is happening with this entire matrix, this graph, is that it's grown to a certain size, and on the fringes there are these new frontiers, which it's kind of bumping up against, and it doesn't want to go into most of them because I think generally what's happened is this matrix has started to, the reality has outgrown this model. Our model is showing its age, right? So it's grown to a certain size where it's bumping up onto these things that it can't integrate because if they're contradictory. It can't integrate them because it'll conflict with other central beliefs in the system. It will, if it integrates any of these things, it might break it. Like these are big paradigm changing things. So the institutions which focus attention, i.e. the media, they try to keep us focused on things that are not hostile to the matrix. And the institutions which are in charge of advancing and gathering new information and expanding the matrix, they are slowing down. They don't really want to expand in too many areas. It's like, we'll expand this area, but the rest of that, like, don't go there. So most of these things that are on the fringes, we're like, we don't want to investigate them. Another way to think about this is that the internet has been an incredibly impactful addition to our information landscape. And that should be no surprise, right? The internet is a huge revolution. But a lot of this ossification and this phenomena of our current matrix sort of trying to contain and resist seems to be kind of the result that the internet has grown around it and is this overflowing ocean of information. And the internet is already it's already breached the walls, so to speak, of the matrix. It's already far larger in the size of this information landscape. It's huge, right? But the problem that we have with that is that we need some structure. We need some way to contain it, right? If the internet has given us this torrent, this ocean, then we need to give it structure. We need to be water carriers and bring some order to that big torrent of flowing information. And many people have started to notice, that we have this torrent of information. We have all of this new stuff. Like, it's really hard to hide things from the internet. So these things are being discovered, like the matrix is leaking. And many people have noticed that our institutions seem to be captured. They seem to not be willing to really investigate these things, do proper science, etc., etc. And many people have pointed this out. Mark Andreessen was on Andrew Huberman's podcast talking, just ripping apart the institutions and doing a really good job of it. And it's well worth a listen. He, goes down through all these different institutions, and confidence in institutions in America is just falling off a cliff. The confidence in the government, in the universities, in the media is all just declining. And, Eric Weinstein has been talking about this for a long time too, about our institutions are clearly captured. They're clearly failing. But what he always says is we can't just tear them down. Like, the solutions right now seem to be either rescue the institutions. This is Sam Harris's view, I would say, is that he thinks, we need them. They're important. They're being annoying. They're being a little bit corrupt, but we have to just fix them. That's what we have to do. Eric, I think, is a bit counter to that. And he says, they're captured. They're terminal. They're worse off than Sam perhaps believes. But he sees the alternatives as either go Sam's route, which is rehabilitate them, which never works. You almost never can rehabilitate a corrupt system. It's just super hard. In the natural world of like companies, what happens is you just let the old company die. and new ones come along. You don't actually fix and like upgrade the old legacy institution. It just doesn't happen. So Eric, I think, sees two alternatives. We kind of try to invent new institutions, which is super hard because the existing ones have capture over the space. They don't let new entrants in, really. There's this kind of cabal effect. And he sees the other alternative as being smash them all apart. And he doesn't like that. And I agree. Like, you can't, it's not a good idea to just smash apart all the institutions. We do need some kind of ordering to these things. Like, free for all anarchy, I don't think is actually a good idea. And so I think, though, there's a third option. I think what we have to do is just be good Aquarians, good water carriers, and we engineer a new way to bring order to the system. We re-engineer the substrate of our matrix, of our information graph. And there's other components to this future solution too that I'll talk about in other videos. But I think what we need to do is engineer solutions to this. So I sort of ran out of room because my iPad ran out of RAM, and this image is huge. But what I think we can do is, so these are just some ideas, but what if we could re-architect our matrix, or add a layer on top of the internet, is one way to think about it, where we have all of this information flowing through the internet. We have this big chaotic mess. Now we need to bring some order to it, right? So what if we could add a sort of substrate on top of it, an economic substrate, and program in certain properties? So for example, suppose we wanted to build out this information graph and discover if something is true. So what we might do is like suppose we stake money on some claim. There's some question, some thing that we want to know about, and people who are interested in it maybe stake money on it. So we put like a bounty on some question, and then perhaps independent researchers could come along and propose, they could make an offer, they could make a proposal. They could first maybe just submit, say, here's who I am, here's my reputation. Maybe they're anonymous, that should be important, but they have some kind of reputation. You can use maybe zero knowledge proofs to prove that they're who they are, who they say they are, without revealing who they are. And you might not even need zero knowledge proofs, but anyway, you have some way of them proposing their, I'm going to do a report on this, I'll look into this. Then perhaps we choose some of them. You have token holders maybe who can allocate, some tokens and just vote, okay, we're going to fund these three, right? We're going to fund these three proposals. Then you have those individuals do their work, submit their findings, and then we have some way of, we review the information. You have some way of deciding of analyzing these reports. So maybe the researchers spend 6 months or a year digging through the information, discovering the documents, finding the information, whatever it is, creating visuals, creating graphs, doing data analysis, doing data science on the stuff, really trying to focus the bright people onto these problems. They produce their reports, then we can read them. We can, if nothing else, you can at least fund independent research this way, and people can consume these condensed summaries of this information and draw their own conclusions. Now, I think what you would also want, though, is some way to indicate some level of confidence about the conclusion of any given question. Because this would be nice to have independent researchers research questions and produce condensed reports. But I also don't want to have to read all of these reports. If there's like a report for every point on the graph, to get very far is still going to take a lot of time. So it would be nice if, in addition to that, we also had some kind of confidence rating, right? So maybe we could find some way to divine out some confidence about the conclusion of the result. And I think there's a few different ways you can do this. So one is you can get a sort of preliminary estimation of whether something is true or not before the results even come in via something like a prediction market, right? So you have people, perhaps token holders, perhaps just anybody. They can stake money, they can bet on the outcome of some data point, of some point in the graph. People think, oh, that's true. I'm pretty sure that's true. So they stake money on it. And then that market, if it's trending yes to the tune of $10 million, then perhaps that's a signal. The wisdom of the crowd is telling you in that moment that that's probably true. And of course, that's only a probably. That's not any kind of guarantee. And I should say too that I don't think it's actually possible to build an information system that arrives at truth with a capital T. The best you can do is focus the minds of human experts and human individuals and have economic incentives that align those people such that you get the best. Hopefully you can sift out the best approximation, the best estimation of the people who know the topic best. And if you can crystallize that, you can get the closest thing to truth that we can manage, right? Beyond that is probably not possible with a system. But if you had some way to have this prediction market, you could have people bet on the outcome. Then, of course, you need some way to settle the prediction market. So, there has to be some way for the conclusion to be determined in a trustworthy way. Because obviously the thing you have to prevent is gaming of the system. You don't want this information graph to produce outcomes that are just the things that people want to hear, right? If there might be a particular bias toward some piece of information being true, but maybe it's just not true. And you need some way to insulate the outcome there to direct it toward the actual truth and not have it be corrupted, right? And so that's a challenge, but I just don't think that it's insurmountable, right? Like how it just can't, like it can't be impossible to solve that, or to at least do a good job of solving that, a decent job, right? Like what if you had like courts? So you could have this information reputation system where you have these people in the system who have a certain reputation that's built up. Maybe they've produced good work. Maybe even they have credentials that we value. They have some reputation, whatever it is. And perhaps we have some question. Reports are produced. Those reports have a certain conclusion. Then maybe a randomly sampled collection of experts from related fields or the same field or something are brought in to arbitrate, to read the papers and draw a conclusion, or to kind of decide that point. And here it would be important to incentive align these people as well. So they would need to stake and say, based on this information, I don't see any flaws. I think these findings are correct. I think the conclusion is correct as given, and I'm going to stake some money on that. So if they do that, they stake some money. Now, I think there would have to be some challenge period, or perhaps an indefinite challenge period, where someone else can come in, and if they can find a problem, if they can attack this conclusion and overturn it, find some critical error, they need to be able to win some of that money, right? Like there needs to be incentive for truth. There needs to be money that can be won for people who can overturn. Like each point in this graph, each bit of information should have some money locked in it. And if you can overturn any piece of information, you should be able to win money. That would be a good incentive, because then you have these people, crawling around through the information web trying to break your model. And if the incentives are set up correctly, all that can do is bring you closer to truth, right? So at each stage here, there needs to be economic incentive where money is staked on certain outcomes. People who produce reports, they also need to stake some money and a bit of their reputation. And at least say, based on everything I've found and discovered, this is my honest assessment. This is the best I can do. Then maybe if there's an overturn, if that information is overturned, maybe they lose some of the money. Maybe if their specific report is found to be wrong, like an incorrect conclusion, maybe they lose all of it. There has to be some way to do this intelligently. But again, like, this to me seems like a problem for crypto economics. It's a problem of using these mechanisms that we know about in the crypto realm, prediction markets and just staking of things and economic incentives and kind of like, attacker, defender situation. If we just develop the right set of mechanisms, I think we can create this sort of overlay container on top of the internet, which gives structure to the internet, which makes this great ocean of internet into this, this directed like system that is capable of divining out truth, and that has these, like a great web, a great map of reality. And you have these people, independent, brilliant people, jumping around through this web and making discoveries, submitting information, overturning things, and it becomes one giant decentralized mass, project of building the new matrix. So the last thing I'll say is that I truly believe that this is possible. And this is the sort of thing that we need a world computer to do. You need to have the economic incentives baked in, and we have that now. So I think we can actually build this. And, one of the things that I hope to offer or hope to accomplish with this channel is some kind of actionable, concrete steps for how we can accomplish these things, how we can build a new system, a new matrix, a new future. And because very often I hear people lament the failings of our current system, and I agree with those lamentations, but it's so rare that I hear concrete, actionable things. It's either everything is broken, we don't know what to do, or if there is a solution presented, it's often people need to raise their vibration and just speak the truth. And I agree, those are great, but we also, I think, need systems. We need concrete things, right? Technology massively changes the world. We can't enact massive shift, massive change, I don't think, purely by meditating and so on. I think we need something more. Also, implicit in this entire thing, in this entire roadmap that I'm kind of trying to get to, is a belief that the truth is good. The idea here is that we're going to better discover the truth, arrive at the truth. And so the implication there is that that would be a good thing. And I do believe that. I do think that the truth will, in some sense, set us free. In the past, it's been rocky, for sure. We seem to get closer to truth, and it's certainly not smooth sailing. But again, I think this age of Aquarius, what we have to do is keep going. I think we have to surf. We have to ride that wave. This wave has already started. We're already on it. We're already in this process where, we've killed our father. The great father is gone, and we're on our own. We have to decide our own destiny, right? And part of that is figuring out what's true. The wrong thing to do would be to try and stop, try and go back. It's like trying to go back to, the house of your father when he's gone, when you're 20 something. It's like you have to go out. You have to go out and explore. And so I believe if we do that, we will be okay and it will be a great adventure. Okay, thanks for watching. I hope that wasn't too long. The next videos will be on maybe proto-dank sharding, EIP 4844. I want to get kind of back to Ethereum a little bit. I'm pretty zoomed out right now. I might also, or I do want to do a video on proof of stake. That's in the back burner. And I have a video on the world computer, like big picture stuff that I want to ship sometime soon. Working on it. And yeah, so watch out for those. Let me know if you have a preference. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Peace.